What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode review for Rurouni Kenshin. This is episode 24, also the final episode of the season. And with me, as always, I have
hmm
Elizabeth.
so yeah, soon after the events of the last episode, of course, Kenshin, of course, ending his fight before his fight gets interrupted by what was it the Home Minister Okubo. So he
Mm.
steps in to to recruit Kenshin in order to help them against Shishio, who's of course one of the former Ishin assassins that was recruited during the events prior to the Meiji government's rise.
I will say, like overall, I have some kind of mixed feelings about the episode and also the season as a whole, because this episode felt like it was more so like a setup episode for the next season, and it felt like we were gonna get this like sort of climactic fight at the end of the season. I mean, we kind of got some of that, but of course it didn't really last too long. Um, and this episode was mostly just just like I said, mostly set up for what's going to happen in the next arc of the series.
Yeah. So, of course, like Okubo gives Kenshin this offer to help help fight against the Shishio. But of course, Kenshin's reluctant to do so. Of course, as we know, he's still struggling with his belief that he should not kill anyone under any circumstance, and it's going to be even more difficult when dealing with a person like Shishio.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So Kenshin and the was it the governor like set up a meeting to kind of further discuss their plans. Um, but of course the his carriage gets intercepted by someone who works under Shishio,
It's
who ends
yeah,
uh,
yeah. It's Seita Sojiro, who's
yeah he ends up assassinating him. Um, but funnily enough, like apparently this other group of people was also planning on assassinating him, and they got there, I guess, just too late because they find his body. He's just coming out of the carriage, um, but they instead just, I guess, mutilate his body because they just stab him multiple times.
yeah.
Um,
I think I think this
yeah,
is more of like a Shishio's plan um to have like somebody else take the blame other than himself. And this of
yeah,
course leads this event will of course lead into further turmoil in allowing Shishio's plan to take down the Meiji government to I guess restore Japan into its warring ways.
yeah. So of course, like Kenshin stumbles upon the scene after it happens and discovers that it was, who was murdered, and that's when he decides that he basically needs to leave and become the wandering Rurouni again, uh, where he needs to basically go to Kyoto and confront Shishio. Um, so the remainder of the episode is pretty much him pretty much just saying goodbye to Kaoru. The Kaoru and the others are waiting for him to return. But at one point, they separate from each other, and that's when Kenshin comes to pretty much just say goodbye to Kaoru, um, embracing her and just telling her what he plans to do before just walking off. Uh, like I said, I didn't really see too much of the original series, but I have seen images and I've seen like scenes from the series, and I have pointed this out before because I felt like I kind of had mixed feelings about this series as a whole, but I couldn't really put my finger on some of the issues I had with it. But I feel like the main one of the main issues is just the way some of the scenes I guess are directed, because like if you compare the scene in the to the scene that happened with the same scene in the original series, um it's a more interesting scene visually, because like you see like all these kind of fireflies around them while they're Kenshin is embracing Kaoru before he leaves. And also like something I didn't really point out much in the reviews, but the soundtrack was one of the main uh like I guess one of the major elements of the original series. Whereas here it feels like I couldn't really tell you like prominent track from this new series that kind of stood out to me. I think I guess you could argue like the new openings and endings are better, or well, at least some of them are. But the soundtrack itself is definitely a huge downgrade, I think, which I think is one of the things that sort of drags the remake down. But I would argue also what I think drags it down is just the way that it's directed overall, because the scene in comparison to like the way it was done in the original, this kind of feels a lot more just, I guess the word would be like flat. It doesn't really, there's not really anything to latch onto like visually. And I don't know. I feel like that kind of takes away from it a little bit, from like the emotions it's trying to convey.
I have to wonder whether or not, like, if they ended up watching the original series, or if they're just trying to take off from the, from the manga panels themselves and do it and make their own
It's probably more so the latter, I guess. Like, because I mean, this is supposed to be, I guess, a more faithful adaptation to the manga. Um, but I think that's what made the original series interesting, was that those, I mean, even if I don't know if that is how it was portrayed in the manga or not, but if not, like it was kind of interesting that they made those changes to kind of like, I guess, put more emphasis on certain scenes. um like there are other scenes where like, you get this sort of, this sort of mood that's being conveyed through just the atmosphere alone. Like, you'd have a scene with Kenshin and Kaoru talking, and like while the sun is kind of setting in the background, and it sort of conveys a certain mood. Whereas in this series, you don't really have anything like that. And I feel like it's a little bit more boring to watch, in comparison, just because of that. But I feel like those are some of the issues I kind of have with this remake. Um, but I mean, I I don't know. That's kind of where we end things off. You see Kenshin walking off, and of course you then hear these other characters talking, and it's sort of like these characters, I guess, that are going to appear later on in the series in the Kyoto arc, that I guess is going to be probably the entirety of season 2, because people say it's a really long arc. Um, but you hear them talking, and of course you eventually hear Makoto Shishio talking, and then you see, the reveal of Makoto Shishio, which he does, like, from what I've seen of him in the original series, it does look a lot like him in the remake. It's just sort of a more updated visual style, I guess, but it does look very similar to how it looked in the original series.
Yeah, and I think it's yeah, it's just this episode itself, like you said, it ends off like in a weird way where it's just mostly build up into what's going to happen in season 2, leading up to the Kyoto arc. As of right now, we don't.
From what I understand, like the entirety of this first season was pretty much just, it felt like it was just there to introduce the main cast in Kenshin, and have them kind of like, the majority of it was sort of is like these slice of life moments, but then also these smaller arcs. The only major arc we had was, the one with, the opium, and that was like that, and I guess the Gene stuff. But aside from that, a lot of it was just these kind of like mini story arcs that took up like 2 to 3 episodes, that really didn't feel all that important in the grand scheme of things. It was more so just kind of, I guess you could argue, fleshing out some of the main cast. But it feels like this entire season is there just to introduce the main cast. Whereas I guess in the second season, that's where they're really going to be, I guess, delving into and I guess the main plot of the series. So yeah, I guess that's why I kind of, again, have some mixed feelings about this first season of Kenshin. Um, it's like, I like the characters, but at times, like, it felt like the series was just kind of dragging its feet in a way. And I mean, I guess the pacing is deliberately kind of slow, because the season as a whole is, like I said, just introducing you to all these characters.
Yeah,
But I don't know, it just felt like there wasn't really anything big that kind of like hooks you or anything like that. I guess they're kind of saving that for season 2. But that's kind of hoping that, relying on people being able to actually sit through the entirety of season 1. So I don't know, like, I feel like, again, I kind of have some mixed feelings about this season as a whole. But
yeah.
I don't know, how did you feel about it?
I mean, there's
I guess as somebody who's watched the original
yeah, I mean,
series and maybe
there's
knows like where it's
yeah,
going.
there's some parts that I liked and some parts that I didn't. It's just it was enjoyable up to the point with the whole opium story arc, but then it started slowing down like in the second half of this season. Uh, I mean, the reason for that is just they wanted to flesh out more of the other characters, um, of the main cast, but it just like it was more the last couple episodes is more of a setup into into the upcoming Kyoto arc for season two.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it does a pretty decent job of hooking people who are already familiar with like who Makoto Shishio is, who are people who are already fans of Kenshin. But people who don't know who Makoto Shishio is, they probably just are going to be left with a lot of questions like who is this guy? Like why should I care? I don't know. I'm kind of wondering how like newcomers are going to feel about this series as opposed to like longtime fans that already know what's going to happen later
Yeah.
on.
I really wish they could have added maybe one more episode, uh, hopefully exploring more of Makoto Shishio. I think that could have been a more fitting way to end the season off, just to display how much of a massive threat he's going to be in the upcoming season. But it just we only get
Yeah,
yeah.
instead we just kind of hear about it from the governor
Yeah,
about how like the threat he poses.
mhm. Yeah, but of course, of course, we'll know once for sure, once season two comes out, and we see how much of it, of a much more dangerous threat that he is. You know, not just physically, but like how much of a tactical genius he is against, take trying to take down the Meiji government, but also, um, he's always several steps ahead of Kenshin in several occasions.
Yeah. Um I'm kind of debating between giving this first season either a 6 or a 7. Uh there are there are definitely things I liked about it. But it could be very very slow at times. But I understand like I guess why it was a little bit slower, but also like I mentioned before, I felt like the soundtrack wasn't really there, and the way certain scenes were directed. I mean, if you go back and look at the original series, it just feels like night and day in comparison.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like maybe that's something that they should take away from this first season, if when they go into production of season two, is that they maybe I guess look back at the original series and look at what worked in terms of the visuals and the soundtrack, and they maybe try to address that. I guess. I'm not trying to say like I want any like I mean, I thought in terms of the animation and everything, I thought it looked fine. I'm not trying to say like I mean I know Leading Films is known for being some a studio like in comparison to like Studio Mappa or anything like that. I'm not asking for some like really crazy fight scenes or anything like that. I'm just asking for the scenes to be a little bit more just visually interesting in terms of the atmosphere and the sort of like tone that they're trying to convey like you see in the original series. Um, and I mean, I don't, that's not saying I want like any crazy animated fight scenes. I mean, hopefully there is stuff like that, but um, I don't know. I felt like that was something that was kind of sorely kind of missing in the remake.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, not only was it a different studio? The composer is they brought in a much different composer than the original series, so it's not much of the stuff
yeah,
is similar to the original. If most people were expecting that, like I didn't expect like anything new of sorts. Like I knew going in that this was gonna be more or less a faithful adaptation. But I knew at the same time this is trying to introduce it to like a new generation of viewers.
yeah. I mean, I guess it's debatable whether or not people who aren't familiar with the series already would kind of would be interested after this season. I will say like in comparison to something like we saw earlier this year, like for instance like Trigun Stampede, where they were trying to say like that was that was supposed to be I guess Trigun for a new generation and trying to introduce new fans to the series. I mean, I think that at least this Kenshin remake did things a lot better than something like Trigun Stampede did, at least because at least with Trigun Stampede they tried to they it was just a weird thing where they tried to do like an original story within Trigun, but then they kind of like I guess kept certain plot points from the original series. It really isn't a good. I would argue it's really not a good starting point for newcomers to the
Uh,
series. Whereas with Kenshin, I feel like this is I think it's again debatable, but for different reasons.
I think I
Um,
would say like one of the reasons I think the remake of Kenshin is better than Trigun Stampede is because of its a double core length, and it took its time to
well,
to delve in more into the character development of sorts.
and it's actually like trying to follow the source material. Um, but I again like some people would argue like oh you should still maybe watch the original Kenshin because of because of certain things it did do better like the like for instance just the presentation the soundtrack and all that even though it did have all the filler um but this is supposed to be a more faithful adaptation of it. um I just feel like I said if they can try to address some of the issues I brought up uh in season 2 I think it would be a much better series for it and we could say like, oh, this is the definitive version of Kenshin that you should watch. So I mean, I'm hoping they do something like that in season 2. Of course, I'm not getting my hopes up too high. I kind of doubt they're really going to address these problems, but I mean, hopefully, if enough people bring it up, maybe they'll do something. Um, but yeah, I mean, who knows? But I don't really have too much else to say though. I thought it was I would say it's a pretty good way to end the first season though, just kind of ending it on a bit of a cliffhanger with revealing Shishio like they did. Even though we didn't have any like really big, climactic fight or anything at the end, it was mostly just set up for season 2.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it sucks that we won't get to know when they're gonna be releasing the second season, but I mean, it could be pretty soon since they already confirmed that it is coming out next year. But yeah, I think
Yeah,
I mean, the Kyoto arc is one of my favorite story arcs of the Rurouni Kenshin series, due to the fact like the villain Shishio himself is like one of the best villains of the series. I mean, of course, it's not the last. He's not the last villain, but of course, it's one of the one of the more defining story arcs that made Kenshin so popular.
yeah. I mean, it'll also be interesting to see how much I guess was cut out from the live action movies that covered this arc of this story arc.
Mhm.
Because I'm assuming there's a lot more material that got cut out from the live action
Yeah,
movies.
I
Um,
mean, to be fair, like they did, like the Kyoto arc in the live action movies, like were two films, so they
yeah,
did as much as they could to adapt that story arc in those two films. So I think they more or less kind of did it justice with the amount of time that they had with those films.
yeah. But yeah, I don't really have too much else to say about this episode in particular. I don't know if you have anything else to say about it
Yeah.
or just the season as a whole. I guess.
I mean, I mean, in my opinion, I think it was decent. It had a decent first half, but it kind of slowed down significantly, like by the second half, until they got to the point where they're truly building up like to the to the bigger Kyoto story arc that's going to be airing for next season. But I mean, for a score, I would say maybe 6.5 would be a fair assessment. Maybe.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, guys. So, I mean, there's really no release date or anything. I don't think just yet for season 2. Um, we were kind of guessing that it'll probably be sometime in the spring or summer of next year, if it does come when it does come out. And I think that's probably likely. I mean, either that or later on next year or sometime.
Yeah.
Um,
I I
but
kinda do have high expectations for the next season just because and how, like and how very well it's
I
made.
think with like the material they're covering, they definitely need to step it up a notch with I guess like somewhat with the animation and just the general presentation of it.
Yeah, because it's gonna be a lot more action heavy, but, there's also a lot more character drama, um, with Kenshin moving forward, when he goes up against Shishio, because yeah, like I said, they really need to step their like, Leiden really needs to step up their game for, season 2 if they wanna make this like a make the Kyoto arc like the best that it is.
Yeah. But yeah, guys. So that all being said, until next time, we will see you all later.